Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing great. I'm doing fabulous, thank you very much. And I'm so glad you've joined me for part 3 of our story tonight, because it's very exciting. We're about to learn that Iris, in fact, owns a property that was left to her by her great-aunt Paula in Nova Scotia around a lake. And it's such an exquisite property, but she didn't realise that she was in ownership of this property because her mother has been keeping this from her. So her mother's about to get a mouthful, but I wonder where this story is going to lead. It's all very exciting. And let's continue with part 3 of our story. My parents lived in Middle Village in Queens. It's one of the quintessential best middle-class places to live in New York. Most people own their own houses here. It's close to restaurants, coffee shops and bars. They live in a green leafy neighbourhood close to Juniper Valley Park, which is 55 acres of glorious grassland and tall lofty trees. It's where my father would ultimately take our family bulldog Poppy for her regular morning walk. The trouble is Poppy loved her walks, but simply hated the return trip home. She wanted to stay at the park indefinitely. Being mulishly stubborn by nature, my father would have to drag that bulldog home, and people who would watch her tugging at the lead would burst out laughing. It was an amusing spectacle to behold, and everyone knew Poppy. She was considered quite the character in these parts. My parents' red-bricked house was one among many houses in this green leafy neighbourhood, where all the houses were rather unique and different, with their own individualistic characters, which made the neighbourhood rather special. The street was lined with tall lofty trees, and everybody's yard boasted manicured hedges and generous borders of pretty flowers. The one thing I did own in my rather financially slim life was a car. I prided myself in this extravagant purchase of note. The likes of such I had never ever regretted. I had bought the second-hand pink Jeep Wrangler from a young woman who had only had the thing for an entire year. She'd grown bored of it. Daddy gave her absolutely everything she wanted, so I had snapped it up at the first opportunity. It was about the only zooty, in-vogue thing that I actually owned. I parked my pink Wrangler very conspicuously outside my parents' house, preempting what I would actually say to my capricious mother, who would likely not be best pleased to see me again after such a long, insouciant sabbatical. To put it bluntly, with no soft edges to cushion the blows, I had not actually personally seen my mother in over 2 years. My father I had seen as recently as only 2 weeks ago. We surreptitiously met up for lunch twice a month. My mother knew nothing about these clandestine cloak-and-dagger rendezvous. Moreover, my father would always ply me with some much-needed extra cash. He'd apologise profusely for my mother's bitter resentfulness towards me, proclaiming that she did indeed love me, but needed more time. How much time did a mother need before she was willing to talk to her own flesh and blood again? I mean, for goodness sake, I was her daughter, and her only one at that. "She's still angry, chickadoo, about your flunking college," my father told me. "You know what your mother's like. She has the memory of an elephant. She's slow to forgive. But I'm working on her, slowly and surely, trying to soften the hard edges. But you know what your mother's like, a work in progress, shall we say?" I glanced at my parents' perfect front yard. Everything was absolutely pristine as usual. The windows so polished, the light of the day bounced off the glass. The lawn, verdant and green, was mown, and all the hedges had been given a fine haircut by a pair of very skilled fingers, while stunning displays of summer flowers liberally tumbled out of a couple of spectacular hanging baskets outside the front door. I nervously sashayed over to the glossy pink door and banged on the brass knocker. My mother adored pink, and that was about the only thing we shared in common, as it was my absolute favourite colour. "Coming!" I could hear my mother's airy voice trill through the entrance hall, as she opened the door and froze when she saw me standing there. She did not expect to see me. "What on earth are you doing here?" she asked me, her eyes growing cold and hard. Was she not even remotely pleased to see me, I wondered? I mean, I was her daughter, for goodness sake. "Nice to see you too," I said sarcastically. "Don't you dare talk to me like that, Iris. I will remind you, you brought this all on yourself when you flunked college. Do you really expect me to be pleased to see you, after everything you've done? We invested so much in you over the years, Iris. Private schools, college, and you threw it back in our face like dirty bathwater. You were an ungrateful, spoiled little brat. Mum, don't you think you should let it all go? It's water under the bridge now, surely. Can't we move on from here? Living with bitterness is eating away at you. If you're not careful, you'll give yourself cancer. And whose fault is that, dear? It's all on you, my darling. Water under the bridge, are you joking?" said my mother, looking aghast. "For you, maybe, but not for me, my girl." "Mum, you're being unreasonable, and you know it. If it makes you feel any better, one day when I've raised enough money, I'll pay you back for everything. But I'm not an investment, Mum. I'm your daughter. Besides, everything in life is a gamble, isn't it? People take losses all the time on the stock market, and they move on with it, don't they? Why don't you look on the money you spent on me as an investment that failed you? Just let it go, for goodness sake." "It's very easy for you to say, Iris dear. But you're not the one who spent all that hard-earned money on you." My mother eyed me through narrowing, suspicious eyes. "Anyway, what do you want? What are you doing here on our doorstep like this? You have not been invited around to this property, and I certainly don't want you here. If it's money you're after, forget it, Iris. If you've blown up your life like a hand grenade, you've only got yourself to blame. We're not doling you out for anything. Don't think you can come to our doorstep begging and borrowing, because it's not going to happen." "I'm here, Mum, because I'd like the deeds to the property that you've been keeping from me for over 15 long years, since Great-Aunt Paula died. You were supposed to hand over the deeds to me 5 years ago. What happened there? Why didn't you? I want them now, along with the keys and the address of Great-Aunt Paula's house in Nova Scotia." My mother's face grew pale. "How do you know Aunt Paula left you her home? Your father didn't tell you, did he?" "No, of course he didn't. He'd never betray your trust. Would you believe it, Mum? I bumped into Judy Manning. Do you remember her? She was Great-Aunt Paula's very best friend. She asked me about Aunt Paula's property in Nova Scotia, which she told me just so happens to be mine. Imagine my surprise when I learnt that I'm actually a woman of property. Something very conveniently that you never bothered to tell me." At that moment my father came to the front door. With a big grin, he threw his arms around me in a warm hug. But judging by the expression on his face, he had heard our conversation that I'd been having with my mother. I could see relief in his eyes, as if he was finally glad that the cat was out of the bag. My mother had obviously sworn him to secrecy, and he'd hated keeping all this from me. "How lovely to see you, Iris. This is a very special surprise. It's been a long time. Must have been over 2 years or so since we last saw you. How lovely. You heard our daughter, dear. She wants the deeds to her property in Nova Scotia that she owns. Don't you think you should go and get them for her? It is hers after all, is it not?" he said, giving me a wink. "Hold on a minute, Mum. Not so fast," I said, raising a warning hand. "I want an explanation. Why the hell have you kept this from me? You could get into serious trouble for this. What you've done is against the law. You were legally expected to hand the property over to me at 21 years old, but you didn't. To say that I'm angry, Mum, is an understatement. I'm grievously upset that you've done this to me. You talk about being disappointed in me, but I'm equally as disappointed in you, so you could say we're even now." My mother practically growled at me. She waved a hand in front of her face and said, "Look at you, Iris. You've made an absolute mess of your life. You flunked college, did you not?
I knew if you were given the deeds to your great-aunt Paula's house, you'd probably sell the place, spend the money on ridiculously frivolous things that you absolutely don't need. I know how flippant and puerile this young generation is, and you're a fine example. You're harebrained and unreliable. I was going to give the deeds to you when you were older and more responsible, when you could actually be trusted. Mind you, what on earth was I thinking? I was deluding myself. Like, when was that ever going to happen? She said sarcastically, raising her brow in abject exasperation.
Mum, I hate to burst your bubble. I really do. But it's not for you to decide whether I'm worthy or not to have a property that has actually been legally left to me by Great-Aunt Paula herself. It's got nothing to do with you. This is my business, and what I decide to do with the property is my decision, I said, holding out my hands. I want the deeds and the keys to the property right now, I said in a stern, no-nonsense tone of voice. To my amazement, my mother obliged my request. She walked away with her tail between her legs, with a sulky gait, returning with the keys dangling in her hands, and a cheque for $50,000. What on earth is this money for? I asked, staring at the cheque in bewilderment. It's a hell of a lot of money. Why would you, of all people, choose to be so generous to me? Are you paying me off for my silence or something?
Nothing of the kind. It's what your great-aunt Paula left you. I feel that since you've got the keys to Purple Rain, you might as well have it all. No doubt you'll pour it down the drain. But see if I care. I'm done with you, Iris. Really, I am. I've worked out the interest. It's all there. You might as well have it now that you've got the house, because you're likely to blow it all in a heartbeat.
I grabbed the cheque, the deeds, and the key to the house, and marched away to my car. My mother watched me from the doorway as I made my way back to the market to recover the groceries I'd left behind. I chose not to be angry with my mother. I mean, what was the point? My great-aunt Paula's house had come to me at the most perfect time, and being mad at my mother would only spoil this wonderful news that was set to change my life. "What?" said Hilda excitedly when she heard my news. "This is absolutely incredible! It's amazing! The best news ever! You have a house in Canada!" Hilda was French-Canadian, fluent in both English and French. Her parents lived in Toronto, so this good news touched her to the quick. "Oh my God! This visualization is working! We're going to Nova Scotia!" We both went out to celebrate our change in fortune, telling Mr. Spindley that he could suck eggs because we were handing our notice in way in advance and would be leaving sooner than he had anticipated. We were to learn that Dave, the overweight man in the apartment, had got so big they'd have to break down the front door for him to get him out, which was something that did not please Mr. Spindley, as he had to arrange the whole thing, and the fire department had been deployed to help evacuate him.
"Good luck to the both of you," said Mr. Spindley. "I'm genuinely pleased to hear your great news."
It was the nicest thing that Mr. Spindley had ever said to us. 3 days later, everything had gone smoothly. Our drive over the border crossing, where the border guards had waved us through, not being particularly interested in our passports. It was certainly strangely nostalgic and wistfully heartwarming to be back in Canada after all this time. The last time I'd actually been here was when I was 10 years old, so my sentimental, dewy-eyed memories of the place were somewhat ambiguously vague, almost as if I was looking at the past through a foggy lens, but a beguiling one at that. I was struck by how magnificently beautiful everything was. The landscape was idyllic. I could only hope that after me and Hilda had settled in Nova Scotia, that we'd find work and be received well by the local community, but only time would tell. "I'd better warn you," I said to Hilda. "I'm not quite sure what condition Purple Rain will be in. Luckily I've got some money my great-aunt left me. It's not much, but it's enough. And I'm the richest I've ever been, so I can't complain. If the worst comes to the worst, we can buy a tent from the camping shop and pitch it up on the grounds until we've fixed up the property. I hope, of course, it won't come to that. But I need to prepare you for the very worst. It's likely to be neglected and abandoned, Purple Rain, I mean. It's not going to be pretty." Are you saying it's falling apart? Asked Hilda nervously. I hope that's not the case, she said, crossing her fingers. I don't fancy camping indefinitely on the grounds. I like my creature comforts. Well, I doubt the house has been touched in 15 years, so we have no idea what kind of formidable shape it'll be in. If my mother had given me the deeds when she should have, all those years ago, maybe things would be different, but it just can't be helped. I mean, think about it. The property could be hideously overgrown. The furniture could have been eaten by mice. There could be a leak in the roof, causing ruination to the innards of the house. You know what neglect does to a property. Just look at Mr. Spindley for your answers. Look at his concrete apartment block. That place was falling apart. Your mother is a piece of work, Hilda. Maybe if you find the place in a bad state of repair, you can actually sue her legally. I would if I were you. I hope she's proud of herself. What a cow! A prize one at that, keeping all this from you for so many years. I hope for our sakes the house is salvageable, and that the maintenance costs won't be too steep. Because if the house is a pile of junk, it might not be worth much. Mind you, the land it's on could be worth a bob or two. My GPS was telling me where to go. Finally, we took a bend on a sequestered road, where the lakefront properties sat on sprawling plots of land, and that was when I saw the neat crisp sign, Purple Rain. I knew I'd found Great Aunt Paula's place. I could feel my whole body twitching with nervous trepidation and anxiety as my pink Jeep Wrangler took the twisted knot in the road, fringed by tall, lofty, imposing trees, and then my Jeep rolled down an earthen driveway, strewn with scattered leaves. Then there she was, proud and tall, Great Aunt Paula's violet-coloured house, nestled on a hilly outcrop, overlooking the pebbly beach and the silvery lake that was reflecting a pearly ethereal light in the late afternoon. "My God!" said Hilda, drawing in an astounded breath. "The house is perfect! It's beautiful! It's spectacular! It's awesome! I can't believe it! There's no way in 100 million years that this house is remotely derelict or abandoned. It looks so perfect. It looks as if it's been maintained, as does the yard. Everything is glowing. The paint is fresh. The windows are as good as new. I don't understand any of this. How is it remotely possible? The house should have succumbed to some wear and tear, surely." Suddenly a horrifying thought trespassed across my mind, and that was when I wondered if the house, having been abandoned for so long, might have become occupied by unpaying tenants, who thankfully had been looking after the place, but had lightly exploited an empty house for their own ends. I expressed these extreme misgivings to Hilda. "It's your property! You call the police!" she assured me. "If someone's living there illegally, they can be turfed out." "It's not as easy as that," I assured her. We both cautiously climbed out of the car and sashayed towards the front door. I was about to put a key in the lock, but the door just swung open on its own accord. Hilda and I exchanged befuddled, rather ominous glances, and I called out into the house, "Hello? Hello, is anyone there?" But there was no answer. Hilda and I gingerly entered the property, and everything gleamed brightly. Great Aunt Paula's antique furnishings were exactly as I remembered, but everything, even on the inside, was freshly painted and new. "What the hell?" said Hilda. "This place hasn't deteriorated in the slightest. Someone has been looking after this premises." "But who?" I asked in wonderment. "Who?" Hilda shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly. We made our way to the downstairs kitchen, which looked as if it had been recently modernized. But how was that possible? Hilda sashayed towards the fridge and commented that it was on, and when she opened the door, she acted as if she'd been stung by a bee. "Oh, my God!" she piped. "Someone is living here! The fridge is loaded with food!" Just as we were digesting this horrifying revelation, and I was wondering how I was going to toss out an unpaying lodger, who had no right to be here, but if it wasn't for them, him or her, that is, and their maintenance of this place, I could have returned to a very bleak picture indeed. So in some way I did owe them big time for the work they'd done to Purple Rain. All of a sudden I nearly jumped out of my skin as a well-rounded, rather buxom woman entered the kitchen. She must have been in her early 70s, with a full head of curly grey hair, and was clearly as fit as a fiddle, with a smooth skin that didn't seem to own a single wrinkle. She was wearing an apron around her ample middle, and had a duster in her hands. She smiled at me warmly through a pair of bright bear-like eyes, which accentuated the dimples in her cheeks. She was the kind of cheery woman you couldn't help but like at once.
"Oh, my word, I don't believe it. It must be Iris Carrington. I'd have recognised you in a whole hall of strangers. You're so distinctive, just like your great-aunt Paula. Oh, my word, it is so good to see you. It's been a long time. My, you have grown up into a fine-looking woman. Oh, I'm not sure if you remember me, dear. I used to clean this house for your great-aunt Paula, you know, when she was alive. But I'm sure you must have forgotten me. It was a lifetime ago, I suspect, for you."
I gasped. "You must be Meg Russo." The woman ran towards me, throwing her arms around me, wrapping me in a warm hug, and I was surprised to see tears gathering in her eyes.
"You must forgive me, my dear,"
she said, sniffing, pulling out a hanky from her apron pocket and waving a hand before her eyes apologetically.
"Forgive me, getting so emotional and sentimental like this. But as I was saying, you're the splitting image of your Aunt Paula when she was your age. So it's bringing back so many memories to me. I knew your great-aunt Paula for many, many years, when we were children, you know."
"But what are you doing here, Meg?" I asked.
"What am I doing here?" she clucked. "What does it look like? I keep the place clean, of course, well maintained. Have been doing so since your great-aunt Paula died. Your father immediately got in touch with me and told me to take care of this place for him. So I've been working here every week, keeping it in apple pie order. He phoned me the other day, told me to get a whole lot of food into the house. He said that you were moving in with a friend. I was so thrilled to hear the great news. About time, too. Purple Rain has been standing empty for 15 long years. Such a waste, if you ask me. But now you're here, there will be life in Purple Rain again, and young life too, which is exactly what it needs. And that would make your great-aunt Paula very happy indeed."
"So my dad's behind how good this place looks?" I asked, bewildered.
"Oh, didn't you know?" said Meg. "Your dad's a very good man. If it weren't for him, this place could have become derelict. And who is it we have here?" she asked me,
her bright eyes fixing on Hilda. "This is Hilda. She's my very best friend. She's moving into the house with me. She's from Canada as well. She's got dual citizenship like I have." Meg looked chuffed to see me.
"The two of you looked so dreadfully tired, if you don't mind my saying so. So I'll love you and leave you. We can catch up another time."
I couldn't believe that my father had preserved Great-aunt Paula's house for me, so I knew I had much to thank him for. It was so typical of him to be this generous. I realized that even though my father never stood up to my mother, he had always been looking out for me from when I was little, and for that I was incredibly grateful. I was so lucky to have a father like him. I knew he had maintained my investment without my mother's knowledge, and for that I knew I would always be indebted to him. I could let go my chagrin towards my mother, because now I had nothing to be begrudging about. The following morning I got up really early and decided to take a casual stroll to the lake, which was not far away from the house. When I slipped past Hilda's room, I could hear her light snores and realized she was sound asleep. I quickly slipped into the kitchen. It was about 5 a.m. It was most unlike me to be up and about this early in the morning, but I couldn't sleep. It was impossible for me to flush away the excitement that I was the owner of a property that was in perfect condition, and to boot, I had $50,000 in the bank, after having been penniless for so very long. It was hard not to wipe the contented smile off my face. Life was beginning to look up. I put on a pair of jogging pants, some walking boots, and a sweatshirt, and scrambled towards the lake, leaving the house from the steps of the wraparound porch that overlooked the exquisite body of water, a view that I knew I would never ever tire of, and I had remembered so vibrantly from my youth. I could almost see Great Aunt Hilda sitting there on the wraparound porch, on her rocking chair, knitting one of her spectacular thick woolen sweaters, while together we enjoyed the views over the lake. They were so prepossessing. We would remain on the porch talking for ages, just looking out at those fabulous views. The sky was now a very light grey colour. The remnant of the night, like a smoke from a chimney, began to gradually dissipate. I could see a round disk of orange light rising over the rippling stretch of water, sending shimmering shadows dancing across the silvery lake. I was absolutely mesmerised by how perfectly magnificent it all was. There was a selection of old weeping willow trees hanging over the edge of the beach, stretching out to meet a sizable congregation of trees, lush with leafy green foliage. The ribbon of beach stretched out before me like a sizable yawn. I walked over to a rocky outcrop on the edge of the water that had been man-made at some point in time by my great-aunt's husband. I sat down to watch the sun rise over the horizon and decided to entertain myself by gathering some loose stones to skim across the lake. My great-aunt Paula had taught me the technique of throwing stones, but I had long since forgotten that skill, so my futile, ungainly attempts were clumsy to say the very least. All of a sudden I heard a distinctive chuckling sound. I was absolutely certain that someone was laughing at me at my expense and my ineffectual efforts at throwing out a stone into the water, so I felt somewhat piqued. I turned around to examine my surroundings more closely, skimming the trees with my eyes to see if I could detect any sign of movement, but nothing was there. In a trice, stones were taking flight randomly through the trees, like darts being aimed at a dartboard, and these stones were projected into the water so perfectly, putting my lousy efforts to shame. I guess I thought some kid who had trespassed on our property was taking great delight in showing me up. So as not to be outdone, I gathered some more stones, hoisting them this time, throwing them very carefully into the water so that in some way I could redeem myself. I would show that gloating kid, whoever they were, hiding behind the trees, I suspected, that I wasn't such a bad shot after all. I eagerly grabbed a handful of more stones, tossing them one by one into the water, very noisily. Something in the trees was hooting again with laughter at me, so much so that I could feel myself flushing pink with embarrassment. I'd never heard such a strange laughter before. I was about to march indignantly through the trees to tell that kid, whoever they were, that they weren't welcome on my property and to go away, that Purple Rain was now occupied and they needed to leave. If they were going to laugh at me so rudely, show off how much better and more superior they were than me, then I didn't want them around at all. Before I could do anything, a timorous shape of about 3 foot tall came running through the trees towards me, with a reluctant, rather evasive hesitancy. I realized in a second that I was observing a juvenile Bigfoot. I could hardly believe it. She was female, and rather on the skinny side, with thin wispy legs, overlong arms, and a body completely covered in long flowing dark hair, apart from her face that was incredibly human-looking. The little Bigfoot stared at me merrily, through the prettiest brown eyes I've ever seen, that were filled with a spirited mischief. Honestly, I felt absolutely no fear. She pointed to my clenched hand, which I reluctantly opened up. She removed the stone from my palm, and began demonstrating to me the skillful technique of how to throw a stone. I remember being caught up in her lesson. I was mesmerized by her, so much so that I barely noticed the sun rise over the horizon, as the little Bigfoot chattered and clapped excitedly every time I improved upon my technique. I marvelled how she could throw a stone over such a long distance, with such precision and so much grace. The two of us were chuckling away together, as if we'd been friends for many years. I almost forgot that she was a Bigfoot, as hanging around with her seemed like the most natural thing to be doing in all the world. All of a sudden, disturbing the pleasing silence, was a shrill whistle. I looked up to see a large, formidable female Bigfoot standing among the trees, looking less than enamoured with her child for brazenly interacting with me, even though she'd obviously done so with a hesitant, prevaricating evasiveness, like a kid who knows they're doing something naughty, but they can't help themselves anyway. Once the little Bigfoot had shown me how to throw stones the correct way. It would seem a bubbling enthusiasm had taken her over, and her shyness had promptly receded. But now she knew she was in trouble. Her affronted mother remained standing there rather stiffly between the trees, barely moving at all, with a less than amused expression on her human-looking face. The Bigfoot became rather bashful, looking nervously from me to its mother. It immediately ran over to its mother, to redeem herself from her mother's impending wrath. I could see the mother Bigfoot seemed to be scolding her daughter telepathically in some kind of exchange. I could almost hear her saying, "What on earth do you think you're doing? Playing with a human being like this? You're not supposed to do this." The little Bigfoot hung her head in shame, grabbing the hair on her mother's legs to appease her, like a shy child might do in a public place. There are no words to describe how big the mother Bigfoot was. She was powerful and intimidating, possibly the scariest creature I've ever beheld in my entire life. In normal circumstances, seeing her might have made me scream out, run for the hills. But I was so bewildered, I stood there gawking at her, my jaw dropping wide open like a Venus flytrap. I think it was hard for me to grasp her Herculean size. I became aware of how fragile and vulnerable I was. I knew how protective mothers could be in the wild over their cubs. A mother bear could easily kill you in a heartbeat if you ventured close to her offspring. Would this mother Bigfoot do the same to me, I wondered? My body shook in a nervous trepidation. Sweat began to break out on my upper lip. I felt as if I wanted the ground to swallow me whole, so I could get away from this imposing creature. But surely she could see I imposed absolutely no threat to her daughter, that we'd just been having fun together, the two of us. I meant the little thing absolutely no harm. Indeed, the creature had helped me improve my technique in throwing stones into the water. Then the most extraordinary thing happened. The female Bigfoot was staring at me, curiously. Then a light of recognition came into her face, like I'd seen in Judy Manning at the store, and in the housekeeper of Purple Rain. Now I was seeing it in the female Bigfoot, who clearly recognized me at once, and then her demeanour changed and softened. Oh my goodness, she rarely recognized me, even though I had no recollection of her at all. She began chatting away at me excitedly, as if seeing an old friend that she hadn't seen for a very long time. She patted my back enthusiastically, so much so that the little Bigfoot's former sense of shame had been replaced with a spark of hope. Maybe she would not get into trouble with her mother after all. Her mother's reaction towards me had significantly changed. I certainly got the sense that Bigfoots are obviously actively discouraged from interacting with human beings, but I realized I was obviously the exception to this rule, as this mother Bigfoot genuinely seemed thrilled to see me. When she realized I didn't remember her at all, or understand a word of what she was saying to me, as she was talking so fast in a language that I couldn't understand, she began to fill my head with memories that came flooding back, and I wondered how I'd forgotten them at all. Had I blocked the trauma of what had happened away like you do when things are so bad that remembering them is too expensive a cost on your personal peace, and so the brain, to protect you, retracts those memories, buries them away in the recesses of your mind, locks them up so that the nightmarish event will not cruelly rob you of your sense of safety in the world. It seemed like that. I did do some research on the matter, I have to say, and learnt it was indeed true. It would seem victims of trauma will naturally conveniently not remember all the details of that horror they faced, like a woman not recalling a sharp knife being held against her throat when a perpetrator intended to slash her, or someone who doesn't remember the full details of being chased by a rampaging bull elephant when they were certain they were about to be trampled to death. Could it be these people erased the memory? It was too painful for them to reflect over, too traumatic. Are our brains naturally hardwired to help us bounce back from a dreadful situation with a healing resilience? It would certainly seem so. Is that what had happened to me? Because I knew many people that had very little to no memory of their childhoods, but this memory came crashing right back like an ocean wave thundering against the rocks. I began to remember one of the most horrifying days of my little life, when staying here at Purple Rain with Great Aunt Hilda, that something quite traumatic had happened to me. It was like remembering something being played back to me in a movie. So there we are. That is the end of part 3. I told you this is a very, very exciting story. You don't want to miss the final part. That's where it gets incredible, and you're going to love every minute of it. What an incredible story. I'm loving it. I hope you are too. So until tomorrow night, goodbye and good night.